At this time, we're going to be going into our first panel discussion. We'll be having two panel discussions, and we trust that all of us who are currently joined will be remaining for the entire day. The first panel discussion will be focusing on the experiences of teachers, students, and the school management personnel. We want to see what are the lessons coming out of the last couple of weeks for those persons. The moderator for this first panel, the moderators are Dr. Therese Ferguson, lecturer in Education for Sustainable Development and a member of the CCEP operations team. And she's supported online in Cave Hill by Dr. Verna Knight, who is a lecturer in Social Studies Education and also a member of the CCEP operations team. They'll introduce the members of that panel. The second panel will focus on the educational policy and support systems. The topic is COVID-19 educational policy and support systems, immediate and future considerations for greater inclusivity and sustainability. The first panel will come, and then we'll have some questions and answers in between, and then we'll come to the second panel. Please stay tuned.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this, our first panel discussion on COVID-19, the experiences of teachers, students, and school management. My name is Therese Ferguson Murray from the UE Mona campus here in Jamaica, and as Dr. Thompson indicated, my co-moderator is Dr. Verna Knight from the UE Cave Hill campus in Barbados. So before we get into what should be an extremely interesting panel discussion, let me just take a few moments to introduce our 5 panelists for this morning. So we have with us Mr. Owen Speed. He is the president of the Jamaica Teachers Association since September 2019. He is the principal of Rousseau Primary School in St. Andrew and a graduate of the MICO and Western Carolina universities. We also have with us Mr. Julian Monroe. He is a qualified teacher who has served the education system in St. Lucia as a teacher and later as a principal. He has served the St. Lucia Teachers Union in various capacities, including as president, and is indeed its longest-serving president to date. Dr. Hyacinth Harris. She has enjoyed a long career in education, moving through the ranks from teacher to principal. She has also served as an education officer, acting in the Ministry of Education, Science, Technology, and Innovation. And Dr. Harris currently serves as the president of the Association of Public Primary School Principals and is also a member of the Board of Management of the Erdeston Teachers Training College in Barbados. Dr. Zoya Kincaid Clarke is a senior lecturer in early childhood education here at the UE campus in Mona, Jamaica. She has vast experience researching in the area of early childhood education and currently serves as an external examiner in early childhood education for the Joint Board of Teacher Education. She is also a member of Jamaica's Early Childhood Development Oversight Committee. And our 5th panelist, Ms. Thatcher Luton. She is the Guild President of the UE Cave Hill campus. She has served the UWI community in various ways through membership and presidencies of various committees, and she is currently preparing to read for a Master of Education degree in educational leadership. So we welcome our panelists. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to share about their organizations, challenges experienced during the pandemic, their responses to these challenges, and significant lessons learned. So welcome to you all, and we now invite Mr. Owen Speed to speak and share with us.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished gentlemen, principal of the Mona campus, Dr. Weber, Dr. Canute Thompson, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, Dr. Grace McLean, and other distinguished guests. As we have seen so far, COVID-19 has brought about several challenges, and it has exposed many of the weaknesses in our system, as well as it has shown us some of the strengths in our system. I think that our principals and teachers across the island need to be commended on the effort that they have put in so far, and especially those who returned to school on June 8th. We are seeing that they have been very creative in what they are doing, and the children have benefited significantly over the past few weeks, a couple of weeks per se. And the Jamaica Teachers Association is pretty pleased with what we're seeing as we go around and just to observe and to support the principals and the members of staff, as well as students. Sometimes we got a chance to speak with the students as we went along our way. I must say that we visited over 40 high schools in recent times since the reopening, and our teams have been out there. I personally visited over 40, and our teams have been around the island in the form of our regional officers and volunteers. You know, as a caring, compassionate entity, the Jamaica Teachers Association, we have repeatedly called on the Ministry of Education to get into planning mode. We are always willing and able to facilitate that kind of collaborative effort. And at any time that we are called upon, we are ready to provide that the necessary support and to, assist the government in coming up with policy framework to guide the process as we move along. We don't know when back to school will be. As far as we are concerned, we are playing by ear at this time, but we would love to get into a mode of planning. We'd like our teachers to be fully trained to deal with the challenges, to understand the operations of the platforms. And, we'd like our children as well to be a little bit more up to speed with the use of the technology. And, we want them to take the knowledge. That is what we are considering technology at this time for them. We want them to be willing and able to take the knowledge and to transform that into something worthwhile and meaningful. As we moved along, we noticed that in the schools, we are seeing quite a number of challenges. We know virtual teaching and learning must continue. As we are seeing it, we are noticing that the schools have been very creative, the school leadership, very, very creative in terms of organizing themselves, using a blended approach where they have virtual teaching going on at the same time whilst they are having some sort of physical face-to-face interactions taking place. As we are seeing it, we are aware that it is very difficult to replace the face-to-face personal touch interaction. And, we would love to have more in terms of infrastructure at the disposal of the teachers and the students at this time. We are seeing that there is a real divide, and some of the speakers before me mentioned some of them. There's a real serious, significant divide out there. And we would like, our government and maybe private public sector partnerships to develop in a real way. And we need to move at a pace when we are speaking about the development of infrastructure, because as we see it, we believe that the bandwidth must be expanded and hotspots should be provided where our children in particular, many of them have come from very poor backgrounds, and we love for a wider range of in terms of connectivity that should be provided for them so that they can access at little or no cost. We are seeing that in terms of the teachers, the educational practitioners, we are seeing that they have been digging deep into their pockets to sort of subsidize or maybe even to maintain the whole virtual teaching and learning process. And it would be remiss of us not to call on our ministers, let's say the Minister of Education as well as Finance, to look at something that they could do in terms of maybe reimbursing teachers for their spend in this regard, and maybe to look at topping up the software and technology allowance in short order. I don't think we have to wait until we have the negotiation at full speed, but we could look at doing that from now so that the teachers are resourced. We love the school system as we are seeing it. We are way behind in terms of providing devices for our students. And we noticed that while we were going around that they were lacking in that area. We'd love to see the system be a little bit saturated. In fact, we'd love our students to have the devices, the tablets for the teachers. That's another one. These are some of the things that we think we'll need. And may I just point out that there is some distribution of tablets to our teachers at this time, but those are coming out of that salary negotiation that went on some years ago. So it is, to some extent, if we want to put it like that, it's really the personal property of the teachers rather than it being given as a tool to be used in the teaching learning process. But we know our teachers, and we know that they will be putting some of those tablets to use in the teaching learning process, and we have no difficulty with that. I think in terms of our teachers, we need to make sure that we have adequate personnel, and we might have been coming up short to some extent recently. So retention of our trained teachers must be an imperative going forward. In terms of infrastructure, and I must say that we have gone to some schools. Some of these challenges that exist in the school system are not just going to disappear immediately, because they will take structural planning and they will take some amount of funding. So we went out and we saw also that many of our schools were not built to accommodate large gatherings anywhere, in a comfortable setting. Schools without auditoriums, and I can say categorically that I recently visited some of those, and I would really like to call on the powers that be to see what they can do in terms of building some structures that are big enough to accommodate cluster teaching. And when we say cluster teaching, where you put several classes together and have team teaching going on, because we want to move as far as possible from the shift system. And, we have to look at all the other approaches, and infrastructure is going to be important. The STEM labs, and may I say that dealing with the infrastructural development, we looked at some schools, and I wanted to single out a few of them. I know they don't mind to say that they need a little bit of help to provide some of these facilities. I visited Camperdown, Seaford High, Paul Bogle, Donald Quarry. Those in particular, I think they need some assistance in putting up some structures that they can accommodate larger groups while abiding by this physical distancing guidelines set out by the Ministry of Health. At one school and some others too, but Paul Bogle, per se, perimeter fencing, we want to ensure that our children are not circumventing the testing and the kind of sanitization that should take place at the school's entrance. And so if they are not properly fenced, then that could be some sort of a challenge with the school administration trying to ensure that they are properly sanitized and so on. STEM labs, we noticed that the STEM labs, in some of the schools, science, technology, engineering, and math, some of these labs need some upgrading. And we know it's going to cost a pretty penny, but at the same time, we would love to have some sort of strategic planning in place where we look at the infrastructure and resources needed in order to ensure that we can have sustainable development in education going forward. A school bus system is something that I think we have missed a little bit of an opportunity during this reopening of school on a phased basis, because we have smaller numbers, and maybe it is that we could have and should have done a test run with a school bus system to ensure that, you know, going forward, we can look at that as something sustainable as well. There needs to be some sort of audit. We are seeing, though, where the ministry, and we must commend the Ministry of Education for conducting an audit. We know it's not complete, but I've seen where the principals are responding so far, and that's a good sign. It is a good step in the right direction. Center of Educational Planning for inviting us, and we are very pleased. We are happy to be a part of this particular discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speed. I'd like to now invite Mr. Julian Monroe to share with us. Just a reminder to the panelists to please 5 minutes or less, because we want to have time to take some questions and engage you in conversation further. So, Mr. Monroe, over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me. I'm honored to be part of this webinar. I represent the St. Lucia Teachers Union, which is both a trade union and a professional organization. As a union, we advocate for teachers' welfare and better conditions of work. As a professional association of educators, we take a keen interest in the functioning of the overall education system. Our guiding principles are respect for human rights, decent work, social justice, and democracy. The COVID-19 pandemic raised new and urgent workplace issues for our educators, and above all, safety and well-being of students and teachers. In terms of health and safety, since in this period, nothing could take precedence over the importance of safety, and since students and educators will be safest at home, the union called for and supported the early closure of schools. Of course, this decision to close schools forced the teachers to change from analog to digital teaching in a very short time. Having to do that created some problems for education and the education system. Moving classes online with just a few days to prepare was very difficult and stressful for teachers, partly because the vast majority had not previously taught online and there was little time to get trained in online teaching. Therefore, it meant also that the working conditions of the teachers had changed. We had students who were depending on their teachers to help them make sense of this new environment, this new, what some people call the new normal. Also, we knew that teachers were very eager to keep their students learning through this crisis. But there were serious challenges. One of them was that some students had no access to digital devices, and in many cases, no access to the internet. Students from disadvantaged households who relied on school meals had to be reached. The teaching and learning process was more difficult due to the lack of social contact, which of course we know being in school, the direct human contact would facilitate. And the issue of resources, schools being closed, teachers had to depend on their personal resources, use of internet, phone data, etc., to ensure that the teaching learning process continued. The work of the St. Lucia Teachers Union during this crisis made clear the need for organized labor, especially in times of crisis. The presence of the SLTU and the work that it did provided members with the assurances that they needed so that they can go about doing the work of teaching the student, understanding that the union was taking care of their business. Of course, the SLTU had its own challenges of having to close its offices. However, during that period, we increased dialogue with the Ministry of Education and other government agencies. We throughout insisted on the importance of safeguarding health and safety. When the government announced the partial reopening of schools, the union had to ensure that the necessary risk assessments were done and that risk mitigation measures were put in place. During that period, we increased our communication with members and activated new channels for doing so. During the partial opening, we have had to increase our monitoring of schools. We were able to ensure the effective implementation of stringent health and safety guidelines for the partial opening of schools. During the period, the government sought to cut teachers' salaries by offering payment in a blended modality of 50% bonds and 50% cash. The SLTU was able to resist that effort very successfully. The union ensured regular and timely information and update to members. This was aimed at minimizing uncertainty, stress, and anxiety. Due to the crisis and the challenges faced, the union increased dialogue with other actors in the education system. The SLTU believes that the COVID-19 crisis would be the catalyst for action to address some systemic problems impacting the education system. The pandemic revealed that our schools were unprepared to create an alternative form of education in times of crisis. As a first step, there is need to encourage our teachers and schools to share best practices, and there should be a system-wide documentation and sharing of those ideas. In the medium to long term, we expect that our government, through the Ministry of Education, will look at reforming the education system to make its crisis response more effective, speed up efforts to bring broadband access to the entire country, ensure equity is achieved in access to digital devices and online learning for every student. Also develop programs that will assist parents in supporting students' learning generally, but particularly in times of crisis, and also to create a system of community support for education to provide for support in times of crisis. We believe that this is the way to go because we are certain that there will be other crises, but we have to prepare for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monroe. Quite an interesting experience that you have shared there. We now move to Dr. Hyacinth Harris and invite Dr. Harris to share from her perspective. Dr. Harris?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Professor Weber, Principal of UWI on the campus, Dr. Kenneth Thompson, Head of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning, all other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen on the panel. Pleasant day to you all. Thank you for the invitation to be here. The Association of Public Primary School Principals was established just over 20 years ago and responds to matters affecting principals in primary, nursery, and special schools. Currently, we seek to represent the interests of all members whenever it is required, and we seek to promote professional and social interaction among our members. We also seek to establish and maintain relationships with other professional bodies such as teachers' colleges and universities, etc. As an organization, As an organization, we seek to share and express informed opinions on educational matters of national interest and to actively participate in the formulation of educational policies. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic was really an interruption that has catapulted us towards teaching that, while not totally new, was thrust upon us even before we were ready. So virtual teaching and learning was the only response that supported the continuity in education. The fact that principals and teachers weren't ready meant that there were challenges in planning, executing, and managing the teaching and learning because of the short window of time that was available. And because of what occurred, we found ourselves confronted with several challenges. First of all, there was the abrupt closure of schools and preparations for online teaching. And this related to principals and teachers getting ready for or transitioning to the online environment. It necessitated organizing training sessions. For the most part, these were done through the Ministry of Education, Technological and Vocational Training. However, within the schools themselves, there were principals who organized internal training with the assistance of the information technology coordinators that are assigned to each primary schools. Unfortunately, nursery and special schools were quite different because of their student populations. For while they too engaged in online teaching and learning, there appeared to be less urgency for them to start in the online environment. Another challenge that confronted us was access to technology for students and teachers to a lesser extent. This was one of the glaring realities with which we were faced. We recognized that there were several students who did not own technological devices. And while there were parents who used their mobile devices online occasionally, we also recognized that these were not ideal for the online teaching. And then as the country began to reopen in the past few weeks, some parents returned to work, so several students no longer had access. Another challenge with which principals primarily were confronted was the fact that we needed to prepare schedules for teachers in the online environment. Because whereas timetables were used in the schools, we now needed to sit and decide how we were going to organize schools for online teaching and learning, we recognized that the timetables could not be transposed to the online environment. And most principals were conscious of research out there from the World Health Organization and other creditable organizations that indicate that too much screen time will eventually have negative effects on students. So there was a concerted effort to organize the schedules so that we can have face-to-face teaching as well as asynchronous teaching. Managing the online environment was also quite challenging for some of us as there was some uncertainty about when the third term would begin, and then principals also were expected to maintain contact with staff, students, and their parents. Maintaining the contact with staff and students and parents was paramount because these are members of the school family. So as principals, we needed to find a strategy for keeping these persons connected and also to demonstrate some level of empathy with those who are experiencing unforeseen circumstances. One last challenge, which I will air in this forum, is the fact that when schools ended abruptly in March, many of the primary schools were preparing the class 4 students for the Barbados Secondary Schools entrance examination. However, the abrupt closure meant that these children now had to resort to online teaching. And this exam, which is a relatively high-stake exam, needs thorough preparation. But there were some steps that were taken to mitigate the circumstances. As an association, we engaged in several online meetings to hear the principals' concern. Our executive is currently divided into groups so that each member of the executive responds to a particular group of principals. We've also had quite a bit of dialogue with the Ministry of Education to ensure that systems were put in place for all school principals and teachers to be trained, and to ensure that everyone was clear about the expectations. The ITCs were expected to organize the training for staff, and this has been ongoing since the lockdown. We, as an organization, we have made several proposals to the ministry for organizing the teaching schedules, the commencement of the third term, and the preparations for the Barbados Secondary Schools entrance examination. So our dialogue with the Ministry of Education is ongoing. The majority of principals, if not all of them, have been trained so far, and that's to the credit of the Ministry of Education as well as the principals in the schools who ensure that the ITCs put those programs in place. In order for our students to access the online teaching and learning, we've had several donations to the school, some through the Ministry of Education and others through the Principals Association and through individual schools. Principals have also been conscious of students needing to have care packages to help their families. So we've done quite a bit of that. Our class 4 students returning to schools, this has been a template for the possibilities for September when we finally open schools fully. And I can say that in terms of our successes, there is increased or improved dialogue with the ministry, and this is ongoing, and this is something that the association has been asking for a very long time. And our principals are better prepared now for using a blended approach to school management. The reopening to students, we've asked ourselves in terms of what are the best strategies? How do we encourage students to be responsible for their health and safety? These are questions that still need to be answered, since it may be difficult to keep our students apart since they're naturally gregarious and often very adventurous. Questions like how the student population will be organized so that no student is disadvantaged. We've considered things like staggered schooling initially. These are options that we have, allowing a specific group of the school population to be in the plant at a particular time. Monitoring the teachers, that's another area that we have to look at. How do we capture data in terms of student attendance and teachers' activities? These are absolutely necessary. But in the long term, we have to recognize that the global trend is towards technology. So there must be a greater thrust towards ensuring that school administrators are on the cutting edge and are technologically savvy to lead their schools. The policymakers at the level of the Ministry of Education, as well as school administrators, must always be proactive. We must observe the trends in education in the global community, as well as in our local communities, so that we can prepare for any eventualities. And we can learn from the experiences of individuals who have passed through this so far and have reopened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. Again, quite some interesting experiences and insights being shared. So we now move on to Dr. Zoya Kincaid Clarke. Welcome, Dr. Kincaid Clarke, and we invite you to share.
Good morning, everyone. All protocols duly observed. Thank you very much for inviting me to this presentation. It really has been interesting thus far. When we talk about how has COVID affected teaching and learning and management of schools for young children, we're really talking about how well are we prepared to manage to deal with 21st century learners without 21st century capacities and capabilities. And that's something that's very important, because for young children who learn in unique ways, how are they able to navigate this new normal, especially in light of many of the challenges that many of them face? So really and truly is that every facet of society has been affected by COVID-19, and young children in the early years are particularly vulnerable and are very sensitive to the smallest shifts and changes in their everyday lives. And while children are resilient, the challenges that have been wrought by the massive shifts have affected them in several ways. And we talk about holistic development in the early years. We talk about socio-emotionally, we talk about physically, affectively, and cognitively. But particularly at this point in time, while we know that there will be some cognitive issues in terms of teaching, in terms of ability to learn, and not a huge part of it has to do with the socio-emotional side of learning and how they're going to navigate all of this. For young children, being uncertain of what is happening, what has happened to their friends, what has happened to their schools, their teachers, it really isn't an easy thing for them to understand. And we know, just as how the other presenters have noted, that there are differences along socioeconomic lines. This is also the reality in many Jamaican institutions. What we know in Jamaica is that young children are at risk. Young children are more likely to live in poverty than any other age group. So a child below the age of 4, just by virtue of his or her age, is more likely to live in poverty, even more so than their parent. And so when you look at that, you're looking at how poverty affects them in a number of ways. So there's some real issues that we have to look at. We have to look at how prepared are their parents to manage to support them at this point. How prepared are the parents to be able to teach them, to support them, to work with them, to support their social development at this point in time. Young children are very vulnerable, and so they need specific tools and strategies. And parents who are dealing with and managing the day-to-day experiences and rudimentary daily life, their daily lives, how do they support or recognize that young children need this kind of support? Young children are often put at the end rather than at the beginning in terms of any kind of support. So you have a parent has 3 children, one in primary school, one in secondary school, one in an early childhood institution. More than likely, the parent will privilege the secondary child and primary age child over the early childhood one, because there is the assumption that not much is happening in early childhood institutions and they just play around, they will catch up at some point in time. So these are some of the realities that we face. We also know that teachers in early childhood institutions are really struggling. Now, what we don't understand is that in Jamaica, the majority of our institutions are privately owned and operated. And because of this, prior to COVID-19, many of them were struggling. So you can well imagine that after COVID-19 or during this time, during the time of COVID-19 and the transition out of COVID-19, if there is ever such a time, it will be worse. And I have had the opportunity to speak with many administrators and teachers of institutions. Some teachers have already been laid off from school. Some administrators have acknowledged they don't know if they will be able to open back up when school ought to open in September. That's a question mark. And so you're looking at all of this. The financial aspect of it is also something that we have to consider. And so, listening to Mr. Speed and hearing about some of the initiatives from the government that teachers in primary schools have been able to, participate in. Early childhood institutions do not benefit from those. And so even the point of the provision of tablets and other technological devices, early childhood teachers do not have access to those. Many of them, the low salaries that they earned prior to, they didn't have those capacities. And so even now, teachers are left on their own. We're looking at this. So many young children are really sitting at home, not doing anything much. So we know there are challenges, but we also know that there is a huge potential for change. So we know that we look at the problems, we have acknowledged that there are several problems, but what are those areas that we can look at in terms of growth and development for early childhood institutions? This presents a wonderful opportunity for collaboration with other institutions, perhaps at the primary school level, This also provides a wonderful opportunity for teachers to transform pedagogical approaches. This also provides a wonderful opportunity for school leaders, should their schools be able to survive this pandemic, to come up with some creative and unique ways and to look at education in a broader, more all-encompassing way. So those are really some of the things that we can look at as we push forward, as we move forward. It really is a challenging time for young children. They learn in unique ways, and technology is not always the best means through which to facilitate how the unique ways in which they learn.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Kincaid Clarke. Really insightful. So to round us off before we move on to a period of questions, we have Ms. Thatcher Luton. Ms. Luton, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Please share with us.
All right, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel. At this time, I'm going to say all protocols observed. I'm just going to talk a little about the Guild of Students and what we do and what I do as Guild President, my personal insights, and just some recommendations as it relates to the educational system going forward. So as evidently, we're currently amid a worldwide trial that has changed our lives. That's very evident. The Guild of Students, we're actually entrusted with promoting and fostering and developing the educational, social, cultural, and economic interests of Guild members. And when we say Guild members, we're talking about our students. Not only that, but as Guild President, I actually lead the student representation system to make sure that students are effectively represented. Also, as the Guild of Students, we work alongside the university to enhance the educational experience of all students. We actually ensure that the university places student interest at the heart of every university decisions. Not only that, we also make sure that university is constantly acting in the interest of the students. In addition to that, the Guild of Students, we're also responsible for student social engagements on campus. As we can imagine, with the government policies and campus health safety measures as it relates to social distancing, no planned activity for second semester starting from March was able to, we weren't able to execute any of these activities. And so the students were basically at a disadvantage. We operate a students union as well. And this students union is a multi-purpose facility run by the Guild of Students. It is really the center of student activities, both culturally and entertainment. And it is basically the perfect spot on campus to lime, to relax, to unwind from the academics. And this is a social aspect, but with the government putting in place and the campus itself putting in place social distancing, we weren't able to facilitate our students in the students union. And so this was a bit of a problem. Not only that as well, but the Guild of Students, we operate businesses. And so it was very difficult in facilitating payment to our suppliers. And therefore it was really a setback for us. But as a student leader and as a leader who operates the Guild of Students, to ensure that the Guild of Students as an organization is fully up and running, there were 3 questions I actually asked myself during this pandemic. And these 3 questions are, how can we manage dramatic change? How can we solve complex problems? How can we lead in a state of emergency? And so one of the things I was able to do as a leader was, I didn't try to steer the ship alone, but I had to dip into my team, and I'm talking about my council, for their diverse opinions. And this was how we were able to channel through these challenges. It also led me to think, not only when planning for the academic year, not only to plan for a full academic year, but to plan beyond. Think of different ways in the future. Think of add technology to our planning, add the right platform to our planning. So actually, it led me to think about these things. But one thing from a personal insight is that the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates to us the value of freedom. The COVID-19 highlights the need for vigilance, for new narratives and reform government institutions. the COVID-19 as well as forced organizations across nearly every industry to alter how they deliver products and services. And I'm talking from the Guild of Students perspective as well. And not only that, but the entire education sector, for example, had to close to facilitate and move to distance learning model. And this has multiple repercussions for IT. As Guild President, I had to deal with the different issues students faced on a daily basis because I'm almost sure that they weren't prepared. Not even the university was really prepared to transition from face-to-face learning, from face-to-face teaching to online classes. And so it was a challenge, but I must commend the UE and our very capable principals who put together the training for our lecturers to do the online Blackboard collaborations and Zoom classes. It was a success. There were a little bit of hiccups, but it was a success. But personally, I'm speaking about the education now. I am glad that these difficult times are driving innovation in education. It is nice to see that something good came from this, even though it was a pandemic and we were not prepared, but we can always say that something good came from this pandemic. Education has changed very little over the last few years, and yet students should be prepared for a job market where things change rapidly. So innovation is a must. And I must say, thankfully to technology, it has become a central aspect of the modern day education experience, with many teachers and students already experienced in teaching and learning with the digital support. And not only that, while the government guidance regarding school closures and social distancing has resulted in a greater digital uptake. Yesterday, I had the opportunity of speaking with an educator in a personal interview, and I was asking him what are his personal insights. And one of the things he highlighted to me, one of the things he posited to me was that it was a challenge of students' initial reluctance in using technology to complete assignments. And I'm almost sure many teachers would have had this challenge. Dr. Verna Knight is actually the moderator now on this panel, and she's a lecturer as well. She's one of my lecturers as well, and she did very well at the online platform, so I must commend her for that. But going forward, I believe that when it comes to education, we need to strengthen an approach that promotes the well-being of people on the planet. We need education that goes beyond providing basic knowledge and skills and leads to awareness, ideas, and action that help us to advance towards sustainable development. I'm almost sure that students, their parents, and educators around the world are feeling the extraordinary ripple effect of the novel coronavirus as schools are shutting down and quarantine methods are being ordered to cope with the global pandemic. As I close, I will say while governments and health officials are doing their best slowing down the outbreak, global education systems are collaborating to collectively respond and provide quality education for all these difficult times. And that is what I love. I love to see the collaboration. And as schools around the world transition to online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, student parents and educators are all wondering, and they're all wondering what this means for education in the future. And while it may seem difficult to predict how the future will unfold during such uncertain times, some of the most pioneering work happening around us can guide us in our thinking. And so I will leave with just a few questions. Well, maybe not questions, but just a few insights. We can say digital education is catching up and probably may surpass traditional classroom education. We can no longer assume that traditional classroom education is the best education. And also, I will leave by saying the difference will be that online learning will be more acceptable and credible in the future. And not only that, but we can not only rely on students and employers or employees to take on the burden of this transition, and I'm speaking from the educational background aspect. Our companies and our educational systems must also be transformed first. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very, very much. Our panelists have given us a lot to think about